Good evening, everyone, and welcome. This evening we are pleased to welcome Dr. Gillian Steinberg to begin a three-part series titled 20th Century Poetry and the Sacred. Tonight's lecture is titled Sacred Places. Dr. Steinberg is a professor of English at Yeshiva University. She also serves as Yeshiva College Director of Writing. She's the author of a number of books, most recently Thomas Hardy, The Poems. And we are very excited to hear the first of a three-part series by Dr. Steinberg.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's very nice to have people coming out on a Monday night to talk about poetry. No, you can't hear me? Come more forward. How's that? Can you hear it better now? Yes. Okay, good. So it's very nice to have everybody here to talk about poetry on a Monday night. I really appreciate your being here. And I brought 3 poems tonight. I want to tell you before we get started on this a little bit about my biases and the ways that I generally talk about poetry. So it was very kind of Rabbi Ganak and the RJC to invite me to be here tonight. One of the things that they said was that the group that comes here is excellent at listening, but doesn't say so much, which is really different from the group of people that I work with at Yeshiva University, where we can barely get them to stop talking for a second to hear what the professor has to say. But I'll say that one of the things that I'm actually working on right now, as the Rabbi mentioned, I've finished my recent book project, Thomas Hardy, The Poems, and the next project that I'm working on is actually about the ways that we read poetry. And my suggestion in this book is that the best way to read poetry, the most effective, the most meaningful way is dialogic. So rather than having one person say, here's what I think this poem means, you actually have to be in dialogue and have conversation about the meaning of the poems, and that we learn from each other that way. So I've spent a lot of time with these poems, and I'm really happy to talk to you about them, but I'd really also love to hear from you about them, because I do believe that that's how we learn, but if you don't like that, that's okay. Just saying. So that's one thing. A second bias that I have as a scholar of poetry is that I tend not to look very much at biography. And I know that many readers want to turn, sometimes right away, sometimes even before reading a poem, to the biography, hoping that there will be clues to the meaning of the poem in the life of its writer. And I really understand that tendency. I think it's very natural to want to go that way. But my suggestion is that the text itself is so rich that sometimes when we look at the life first, we actually trick ourselves into thinking that we've understood something about the text that in fact we haven't, because the life can suggest things that may not actually be true of the poem. So I can tell you a little bit about the lives of these 3 poets that we'll be studying tonight, but I would also suggest that before we do that, we really look at the text to see what the text seems to be saying, rather than guessing things about the poet's life. And I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more about why I have that approach to poetry. I've really developed it over a number of years and thought a lot about it. And I think that it's really important, actually, as readers of poetry, that we study the text for the text itself before getting too hung up on the author. And that's something that I would say is true also of the visual arts and other fields as well, where we often want to say, well, I think I can see in Starry Night a little bit of Van Gogh's insanity, right? So we know this like sort of one sort of juicy detail about a person's life, and then we can find that in everything. And I think that that's actually a shortcoming of reading in a way. So that's why I'm not going to begin by talking about biography. And the other thing I'll say is that I've chosen these poems very carefully because of things that I like in poetry. So I hope that these are things that you also like in poetry, or that by the end of the evening you will have grown to like in poetry. But one of the things that I often look for in literature that's meaningful to me is a kind of ambiguity. people who approach things with multiple possibilities, people who aren't very sure of themselves, but walk into a situation saying, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And a poem that expresses that ambiguity is very meaningful to me. So you'll notice that all three of the poems I brought tonight have that kind of ambiguous angle, and that can be frustrating, I think, sometimes, because we want to say, what's the answer? Or we look to the poet in the sort of romantic vein of a Wordsworth style writer and say, tell us the truth, almost as though the poet is a seer. But what we find in the 20th century is much more poets opening themselves to us and saying, there are a lot of questions that I have, maybe you have these questions too, as opposed to, you have some questions and I have some answers. So you'll notice here that we're looking at poems that have a lot of questions and that may not come satisfactorily to conclusions, but that I think present the questions in ways that can be really fruitful for us to think about in our own lives, and that can prompt us to come to our own answers, as opposed to providing those answers for us. So those are the things I want to start with as a preface, and then I think I'd actually like to just start with Cynthia Ozick's poem, In the Synagogue. Many of you probably know Ozick as a novelist. Her most famous novel in recent years is Heir to the Glimmering World. Some of you may have read that. She often writes about issues having to do with the Holocaust and other Jewish experiences, Judaism in America, and many of you may know The Shawl, which is her most famous short story. She's less known as a poet. So I'm going to read this one, and I'll talk to you a little bit about it. And as I said, if you have things to contribute, I hope that you will. In the synagogue, I do not understand the book in my hand. Who will teach me to return? Loss of custom, ruin of will, a memory of a memory, thinner than a vein. Who will teach us to return? To whom nothing speaks, not shofar, not song, not homily, on whom nothing was wrought, not slaughter, not horror, not Holocaust. History is not my concern. Suppose even God turned out to be a God. We do not want to come back. We do not know where we are. Not knowing where we are, how can we know where we should go? Now, one of the things that I love about this poem is that it expresses a level of frustration in a place that's set up as a holy place, and asks questions that I think everyone faces at some time, that I wouldn't say are necessarily true of the speaker of this poem in every moment, but maybe true in a certain moment or in a certain place in the speaker's life. And obviously it's a poem about tshuva and about returning, and it's saying, do we want to return? And how can you return if you don't know where you are now? My favorite line here is, suppose even God turned out to be a God. It's a very sort of obnoxious thing to say in a synagogue, to ask that question. But there's that moment of doubt, and that moment where the speaker is questioning his or her own presence in the place and the goals of being there. And I think we see that in the surrounding questions as well, but in some ways for me that feels like the heart of the question, right? Because if that part's not real, then why all the rest? And the idea of looking for a teacher and of not understanding the book, so much of this is about being surrounded by foreignness, right? And the idea of trying to return when something is so foreign or feels so impossible, I think is part of what she's working with here. But I would be interested to hear if you have other reactions to this, and we'll talk for a few minutes before we move to the next one. Yes?
My question is, when was this written?
So that's a very good question. I actually spent a very long time trying to find when this poem was written, and I couldn't find it. What I can tell you, though, is that it was written sometime since the 1960s and before the 90s. So I have it reprinted in a collection, and I've looked everywhere to find which original collection it was printed in. And of course, when it was printed is not necessarily an indication of when it was written either, but the middle part of the 20th century, let's say.
She's always been a follower of Henry James.
Mm-hmm.
And in recent years, she's become very, very mannered in the James manner. This seems to be very unmannered.
Right,
very
interesting.
Simple,
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like the symposium for the last 10 or 15
That's
years.
interesting. That's her prose writing, though, don't you think?
Yeah, but-
More than the poetry?
But even if you hear her just talk on the radio,
Yeah, she sounds like that.
she is becoming so mannered that it's almost impossible to follow her.
Oh, interesting.
And this
Okay.
is completely unmannered.
Absolutely, and I think it's extremely accessible, which is one of the things that she's doing here, is really, it feels like speaking aloud in a very conversational manner, right? So this is a poem that seems to be bearing its soul in a way that probably someone in a synagogue would not feel comfortable saying aloud, but it does feel like an expression of sort of raw thoughts and emotions. Now, of course, if you look at the structure of the poem, it is actually very structured. It's not as free form as the words seem to indicate. We have a rhymed couplet to begin with, for one thing. I do not understand the book in my hand. Now, of course, when I read the poems, I read them by the punctuation, not by the line breaks. But if you do the line breaks there, you notice the rhyme. And her playing with couplets interspersed with other lengths of stanzas is actually very consciously done. So, I would guess that it's that the tone, in a way, belies the formality of the poem. Yeah, Micha?
Even though it seems as though it could seem as though she's sort of given up, like, in other words, this is not my thing because I have all these reasons that it's not speaking to me.
Right.
On the other hand, I think there's a pathos here that she really wants to feel.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I think that that's part of the ambiguity that we find in very many of the modern poems about religion and loss of religion. There are many, many, many poems of this vein. Not so many Jewish, although, if you look at the whole body of modern poetry written in English, as I guess if you'd look at all the poets, right, a small, small percentage are Jewish. But that theme through the 20th century of loss of faith, loss of religion, as you all know, is very prominent, and it's in many poems. And I would say that actually in the majority of them, there's a sense of longing and of, I don't know if I would go so far as to say hopefulness, but a hope for hopefulness, right? I wish that I could have this. I wish that I could believe in this. And I would say that although we tend to think of the 20th century, maybe the latter part of the 20th century particularly, as being a time of loss of faith, what we see in the literature very often is a longing for something that feels just beyond one's grasp. But I would say that there's actually another reason in this poem that we see her attachment to the desire and exactly what you're saying, not having given up. And that's that the poem's titled In the Synagogue. These are questions that someone could have anywhere, right? If you've gone to the synagogue to have them, you're trying, right? So the title itself suggests an active seeking as opposed to a having given up or a full frustration. Yeah?
Well, I would think that this was written earlier than the 90s because where it said, I do not know, who will teach me to return? Now, in today's day and age, I mean, there's kiruv all over the place, and if you're truly interested in returning, it's there. I mean, Chabad is there. It's
Interesting.
All, it's here. So at that time,
That's
I don't know in the
interesting.
60s if this
Right.
was so obvious that there are people who would.
That's really interesting. And that feels like a kind of practical concern that I don't know that she's raising here, right? Like, I think at any point, in America, post-war, if someone had said, like, I really want to find someone, like, really find someone who will teach me to return, it was probably doable. This feels more like an existential question than a practical one. It's not like I've knocked on a bunch of doors, but no one's helping me. It's something more internal, right? I can't find the thing I'm looking for or the kind of teacher I'm looking for or the sense of self that I'm looking for that will allow me to do this. So I think there's a frustration about who will teach me, but that's certainly not the only frustration expressed in this poem. And if we look, it starts with the frustration about the book. I don't understand this book. And it continues with the frustration of no one speaking. The shofar doesn't speak, right? So this is someone who knows what the rituals are, isn't needing kiruv necessarily, right? There's knowledge here. The very middle of the poem, on whom nothing was wrought, not slaughter, not horror, not Holocaust, suggests something about a kind of pain that's preventing the return. not just an ignorance, right? Not just, I wish I'd been taught better, but there are emotional barriers to that kind of return as well. And I wonder how genuine or disingenuous I do not understand the book in my hand is. Does that mean literally I can't understand what the words say? It could mean that. I don't really read it that way. I think it probably means something more like I don't understand its depths, or it's not speaking to me in the way that it should. Now, you see when I'm talking about those things that I'm really placing a lot of interpretation there. I do not understand the book in my hand in complete isolation. Could mean any number of things, and the most obvious reading would be a very practical one. This book is in a different language, maybe I don't speak that language, I don't understand it. Taken in the context of the rest of the poem, I think that my, maybe slight overreading is probably justified, which is this is a bigger question, it's a deeper question than just, I never went to Hebrew school, right? Yeah, Matt?
Isn't there also a rejection on her part here, when she says we do not want to come back?
I think that there is, but, right, exactly, it's the ambivalence. I think there's that line that says we do not want to come back, but it's immediately followed by we do not know where we are.
But
Right.
I think this is also someone who understands the things that could bring her back, but chooses to not have them bring her back. So she understands that Holocaust and slaughter and horror are things that Jews traditionally connect with. She says history is not my concern.
Right, I think that's true, and that's where we see that real ambiguity. There are levels of this poem that say I don't want this, and I think many profound levels that say I do. Right, and I have to say that the one that says it the most to me, I mentioned the title, the one that says it the most to me is the poem's existence, right? If you don't care about this, then why write this, right? There's a level of caring in its creation, right? If you don't want to come back, you write about something else. So I think saying we do not want to come back is disingenuous here. That's how it feels to me, especially when it's followed as it is by we do not know where we are, and then not knowing where we are, how can we know where we should go? That feels like a question of frustration, of throwing up one's hands, not of, I know what I want and it's not this, right? So one of the things you notice, just as we're talking about this poem, is how much you have to read into the tone and the voice. And you may notice that I'm talking about the speaker not as Ozick, and I'm even trying to be careful to say he or she to discuss the speaker. Now, again, that's a convention, and it is a little bit of a bias on my part. It may very well be that these are exactly Ozick's sentiments, and she is trying to say them. And if that's the case, then we could turn to biography for just a moment and know, for example, that she does understand the book in her hand, right? So we could do that. But I think that it's important also to recognize that just as when we read a novel, we don't assume that the I of the novel is the author's voice. We can't assume that the I of a poem is the author's voice, although for some reason, in poetry, we are more predisposed to do that. I think we tend to think, especially in contemporary America, of poems as sort of outpouring of one's heart with no barrier. But I don't think that actually most poets think of poetry that way. They actually think about creating a character who's speaking in the same way that novelists do. And for some reason, we all feel very comfortable doing that in a novel. When you read in a novel, say a mystery, and it's a murderer writing in the first person, you don't think, oh my goodness, the author is a murderer. Right? We're very comfortable with that separation, but for some reason in poems we tend to assume that there's a connection. So I don't know that this is what Ozick thinks at all. It may be Ozick trying to imagine what it feels like for someone to be in the synagogue who has those kinds of emotions. Yeah?
When you know something about the author of the poem, it's very hard to put them out of your mind.
It certainly is.
Now, Cynthia Ozick, I know in the 70s, sent her daughter to the Westchester Day School. Mm-hmm. She was active in Anshe Shalom, Orthodox synagogue.
That's right.
In New Rochelle. She had a niece who was murdered in Israel.
That's right.
Walking on a beach, and the terrorists came and arrested and killed her. And she wrote a piece for the Times that was the most moving response to terrorism I've ever read in my life. Yet she's also a rebel. She wrote a novel sort of attacking the Westchester Day School.
Right.
So she,
they love that. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Since you're a fan of Thomas Hardy, when she spoke at her daughter's bat mitzvah and shalom in the late 70s, the key to that was a line from a Thomas Hardy novel, which she got wrong.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Have you written a biography of Ozek? You seem to really know a lot about her.
Our son was in the class with her.
Got it. Okay, so you have the insider gossip line, not the Wikipedia stuff, the real stuff.
Also, she's written a lot about herself.
Absolutely. She has, absolutely. It's true.
New Yorker about growing up as the daughter of a
Yes.
druggist.
Yes, yeah, that's a beautiful piece. She's a great prose writer. So I'm hoping you don't know as much about the other two because it's going to ruin my whole don't do the biography thing. No, it's okay. But absolutely, we are dealing with someone here who is a person who's been attached to the community and also has a sort of rebellious side. But I think there's a level on which you can say that about almost everybody, right? I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but, you know, it's hard for me to imagine a person who's involved in Orthodoxy in a really integrative way who doesn't at some moment have some question. And if you're one of the people who doesn't have any questions, I'm very impressed. But I think, you know, it's a very hard thing. And so to put a character together who asks these questions and who expresses some of these dissatisfactions or frustrations in some ways feels very honest and something that maybe each of us couldn't express exactly this way or maybe wouldn't want to express exactly this way, but can on some level understand as well. Yeah, a couple comments and we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah. I want to comment on the line that on whom nothing was wrought, not slaughter, not horror and Holocaust. It can be looked two ways. Many of the people that survived the Holocaust, the Auschwitz and so on, left religion because they said, what kind of a God that can let this happen?
Sure.
And so she could write from this point of view. That, you know, I'm in a house of prayer, you know, but she must know about the Holocaust. It was written probably, like you say, in the 60s or 70s. In other words, she was aware of what happened.
Oh, for sure, of course,
in World War II.
Absolutely.
The other side that I'm looking at is people, religious people, or people that are used to prayer in the synagogue are familiar with certain prayers that deal with slaughter, horror, and Holocaust. Whether it's on Tisha B'Av, where we read the
martyrologies, sure.
Various crusades where Jews were killed. So she's saying, you know, I'm in the synagogue, but I don't know much of the history, that Jews experienced over the centuries.
Right.
So how can I pray?
It's possible. It's possible. I think one of the things you want to look at there, and those lines are difficult in this way, is look at the grammar. If you look at the grammar of those lines, they're fragments, right? To whom nothing speaks. Well, who's she talking about in that line? To whom nothing speaks could be me. Nothing speaks to me. I'm the person to whom nothing speaks. It could refer back to the line immediately preceding, who will teach us to return, right? So will that teacher to whom nothing speaks teach us to return? It could be about that person, but also because we have the to return, move to whom nothing speaks. Are we meant to return to someone to whom nothing speaks? It's very confusing, and I think it's meant to be very confusing in that way. That it may very well be that it's about the speaker, but it intentionally lacks that first person pronoun there, and it's not a poem that otherwise hesitates to use it, right? It starts with I, and yet in those lines, we don't have the I. And I think it leaves it open-ended, not just the two readings that you provided, but also who's even being discussed in those lines that nothing's speaking to. There's a lot you can do to work with that. Yeah, Michal?
Yeah, so in that vein, and you sort of tended to suggest this, I think of it as now as a challenge to those who appear to be or are very, very settled and happy and in their Judaism. Come on, reach out to us. Tell us what we're in this lost place. We're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Tell us how to come in.
Yeah, it may be. One of the things that I think is interesting here too, though, in that regard, is that I don't know that this is a person that you'd be able to tell is asking these questions. Right? It sounds like it's a person who's in synagogue holding an open book. Would you know that that's the person to whom you need to reach out? I don't think that it's a clear thing, because what we have, I think, is a very different interior from exterior. This is the interior voice, but if you picture the exterior situation, it probably doesn't look very different from anyone else in shul, right?
But this person, she's almost crying out on behalf of a lot of people that she knows
Yeah.
also that seem to just, like, what is it?
It may be.
How do we get it
Right.
out of it?
But we don't know who's doing that crying, because this could be anyone's voice. Yeah.
Do you place any importance on the fact that in the beginning, she seems to be talking about herself as an individual?
Yeah.
But later on, immediately after.
Absolutely,
for example,
good.
I do not understand the book. Who will teach me? And then
Good.
she immediately says,
We,
we want to
Right.
come back. We don't know where we are.
right. I think that that's actually very important, that switching of the pronouns. It starts off as a very solitary poem in the way that this concern is expressed, and it ends up being a very communal poem, right? And saying, I'm not just saying, I don't know where I am, we don't know where we are. And whether that's just, as Michal's saying, some small subset of us, or all of us, we don't know where we are now, so how can we know where we're returning to? I think is very powerful in that it's created a connection that didn't exist at the beginning. And it's worth noting how poets, even in a short poem like this one, develop character over time. That is, it's not settled from the beginning. It never returns to that idea of the book, and it never returns back to the first person singular. It remains in the plural to the end. But I do want to move on to the other poems. This is what happens, right? First of all, totally participatory. You guys are great. Excellent. But what happens is you realize that you could talk about any one for a whole hour or 3 hours or whatever. So I'm going to just force us past it. Sorry, because I want to make sure we get to the other ones. They're so good. So the next poem is called At the Wailing Wall. Again, I've chosen a spot, right? A place. Oh, do you not see it? It should be on the back side of the first one if you flip it over. You see it? I was trying to save paper. And this is by Jacqueline Asherow. So did she go to school with your kids? No, okay, good.
Don't know her at all.
You don't know her at all, okay, great. So I'm gonna read this one. This is a sonnet. It's in a conventional sonnet form. And again, it gives us the place in the title, okay? And then asks a number of questions throughout. All right. At the Wailing Wall. I figure I have to come here with my kids, though I'm always ill at ease in holy places. The wars, for one thing. And it's the substancelessness that sets me going. The holy words. Though I do write a note, my girls sound future. There's an evil eye out there, you never know. And then pick up a broken-backed siddur, the first of many motions to go through. Let's get them over with. I hate this women's section almost as much as that one full of men wrapped in taluses, eyes closed, showing off. But here I am, reciting the Amidah anyway. Surprising things can happen when you start to pray. We'll see if any angels call my bluff. I think this is a pretty remarkable poem also, in that same tension that we saw, maybe with less of the weight of history behind it, but a different kind of frustration and a different kind of desire, I think, again, brought together within one work. First of all, the fact that it's a sonnet is meaningful. Sonnets are traditionally love poems, and so when a poet chooses to write a sonnet, it's suggesting that there's some kind of love, even a tense or complicated love involved, and so the form itself is kind of speaking to its readers. And then the development, as we were saying in the previous poem, there's a development of character here, that the last couplet is sort of the punch at the end, right, to drive home. So I would ask, do you think overall that this is a poem that shows a desire to be part of Judaism or desire to pull away? Steve?
To me, it seems she's standoffish. She's waiting to see whether angels will call her bluff. That I really don't believe, but let's see if an angel will come out of the wall and prove something to me.
So the question then is, what's the bluff? Right? There are two bluffs here. It's possible. So what's the bluff that the angels are going to call?
That she doesn't believe.
That she doesn't believe. Okay, so it's possible. Are any angels going to come and call my bluff? There's a little bit of a problem with that, though, right? I mean, I guess maybe it's saying, I'll believe if the angels show up. But the very reference there suggests a kind of belief, right? If the angels are going to call the bluff, then they don't really have to call it, because if they show up, she's going to believe. Yeah.
The first 12 lines are very critical. but the last two, as is typical in a sonnet, you sort of switch.
Right.
She at least opens the possibility that she may be wrong and there's something real there.
Right, so that's actually typical of the English sonnet, to have that last two lines. The Italian sonnet usually switches at the 8th line, so we can see if there's a switch there. And here, the 8th line, where what we would call the volta in the Italian sonnet, says, let's get them over with, right? I'm sorry, the 9th line, at the beginning of the sestet. So there, we don't see that turn, unless you want to read that as a turn, right? That's what the volta means, is like a change in attitude. But I don't know that I'd say that the first 12 lines are all negative. I think there's also a little back and forth there. I think standoffish is a good word, but also a little chip on the shoulder, a little unwillingness to let down a guard, right? But even in those first relatively negative 12 lines, there are moments where you see what Michal had said about the previous poem, which is a want to want it, right? Because again, do you pick up the siddur if it's just emotion to go through? Do you say the Amidah if it's just emotion to go through? These are interesting things. Do you parenthetically say, you know, I'm going to write the note because you never know, which I think is very similar to that idea of referencing the angels? I mean, there's an evil eye out there. You never know. Doesn't feel like the line of a non-believer, right? So it's sort of playing with that. I don't want to. I'm modern, maybe. I'm concerned about the gender separation. There's something here that's making me uncomfortable. The wars, all of the things that are referenced in the poem that are discomforting, and yet I'm doing it, and I'm doing a little more, and a little more. And then, at what point is going through the motions not going through the motions anymore? Right? I think that that's sort of a question that's being raised here. And of course, we know also that that's a very Jewish ideal, right? You do it until you believe it. You don't have to believe it first. You have to do it first, right? And there's some level of that happening here. Do you think Asherah knows that? Yeah, she's Orthodox. She knows it. So now I'm not talking about the speaker of the poem. I'm talking about the person who crafted it, right? And that's something that she knows about Judaism, and she actually is a practicing Orthodox Jew. Yeah.
And then you see it even in her writing, the fact that it kind of falls into a rough rhyme scheme by the end.
It does. That's right, absolutely. So it starts off feeling, although it's still a sonnet at the beginning, you can tell that from the beginning, the lines are more irregular, and it lacks the regular rhyme also. And by the end, you have more of a pattern. And so there's some regularizing that happens. And it does kind of move into a more comfortable place just in the reading of the words. Saying the word substanceless, for example, it's just a mouthful, right? And there's an ease of the reading as the poem moves on. So that's a really good observation, too. Yeah?
The one segment I don't really follow at all is the wars, for one thing.
Yeah, is that hard?
It doesn't fit, or I don't see how it fits. And because she's very clear. I mean, this is a woman who's very ambivalent about what she really believes, but she's not about to walk away from it.
That's right. That's what it seems like, that she's not willing to walk away. And
but what do you make of the wars?
well, it's interesting because the wars aren't specifically, it seems, about Yerushalayim or about Kotel. It says, I'm always ill at ease in holy places.
So, exactly.
Right. So I think that it's...
Here, unless the only thing I'm coming up with is the taking of the wall. Was, I mean, remember that iconic picture
Right.
of the paratrooper. But
Yeah.
beyond that, I really don't see that fragment in this poem.
That's interesting. So I do understand it, I think. And I think that there she's saying that holy places in particular that have wars, and I think holy places generally, not just that specific wall, right? But the holy places that have wars make her uncomfortable, make her ill at ease, because there's a contradiction in terms there. Why is it that there are wars in a holy place, right? And that's something that is uncomfortable.
Is she talking about gender wars here? Is she talking
I don't
about
think so.
communism and secularism?
I don't read that as gender wars.
No. Well, she's...
Yeah, you get into gender later, but it's not even a hint of it yet at that point. At that point, I don't think you have even a sense of the gender of the speaker.
I mean, to me, this still doesn't fit.
No? Okay, sorry. No, don't apologize. That's okay.
I think the concept of wars is the fact that Israel's victories have been miraculous. And so.
Very nice.
She's
That's
saying
good.
the fact that we have survived all these wars gives me a reason to go to a place that's holy. And
Oh, interesting. And that's what makes her uncomfortable because she's not sure that she believes in miracles.
but I wanted to get back to something else you said before.
Okay, then I'll say something about what you just said. That's
And
fine.
that is, you said that when we read a novel, we don't expect it to be the person's point of view.
Not necessarily.
Period.
Right.
But I think that's why the novels are called fiction. Poems are not called fiction.
That's such a great point. That's what I'm writing my book about. Okay, so here's the thing. Poems are not differentiated in the same way that prose is, right? We have the larger category of prose, and then within it, we have fiction and nonfiction. We have the larger category of poems, and within that, we have narrative, lyric, and epic. None of those three specifically says true or not true the way that prose does, and it's so interesting. And so what we generally assume is that epic is not true, right? I mean, no one thinks that Homer was Odysseus, right? We have an expectation there that epic is not autobiographical, and we assume that lyric and narrative are. But what I question is why we assume that. Is there a truth to that assumption? So I think you're pointing out something really important, but to me it seems like almost a flaw in our system of categorization as opposed to a truth about poetry.
Except that we feel that when a poet writes something which has something to do with themselves, we believe that they're speaking out there.
Yeah,
So
I think we're wrong though, when we believe that. I think we're generally wrong, and if you look at what many poets have said, they say we're wrong. We always read Emily Dickinson as personal, but she said, don't, I'm creating a character. She said it. But we just can't believe it because we think we know so much about her, and she's Emily Dickinson, and she writes all this personal stuff about being lonely, and we know she was lonely, so it must be her. And she says, it wasn't me. But we don't believe her.
It's true.
You don't believe her?
No, we don't believe it.
Oh, we don't believe her. Okay, good.
It's in her house, so we don't.
Right, it's true. And so I think it's just a very interesting assumption that we make based on genre that I'm not sure is a well-placed assumption. I certainly understand why people feel that way. But I guess I would just suggest when we're together for the next couple of weeks that we suspend that belief just for a couple of weeks to read some poems and say, is it possible that these are fiction? I think it is possible, and I think it's a shame to assume right off the bat that it's not. So, that's, sorry, that's like my little bandstand thing. Yes?
I think, in the end, when she says, we'll see if any angels call my bluff, and that's right after talking about full of men wrapped in taluses, eyes closed, showing off.
Right.
She has her doubts, but somehow I think that I could see that this is a religious person writing this, but then she's putting her, because angels call my bluff, up to me that means, we'll see if I can get through the Shemona Esrei in sincerity, or if the other side of me pulls me away.
That might be the calling the bluff, that's right. It might not be miraculous calling of the bluff, right, yeah.
But at the same time, I think, so, when you think something, then you put that on somebody else too, so because she has these doubts, so she
Yeah.
thinks they're all just pretending.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, that's right.
That's what.
It's such a cynical way to read other people, right? It's such a cynical reading of these other people who may be having the most profound religious experience, and she's saying, oh, look at them showing off, right? But of course, we're meant to see that as a reflection on the speaker, which again is why I think it's important to separate speaker and poet. The poet here is perfectly smart, and she knows that she's setting up a speaker who has a kind of ignorance or a kind of barrier or a wall, right? It has to be a poet who recognizes that in the speaker, right? And so I think you're right. It's showing a speaker who has created so many barriers that she can't even see someone else having a religious experience, which in a way is quite different from the previous poem. Although it has that communal sense, in the Ozek poem, it still seems to think that there are some people who do understand the book, right? This one is saying, oh, look at them showing off. Right? And so it's even a more cynical read. But I think that there's also a very deeply faithful part of it too, as you point out. And I think it's also pretty clearly written for a very Jewish audience because we don't have definition of terms here either. It's willing to throw in Siddur, Amidah, expect that its reader knows. And so it's writing for a particular audience in addition to for a particular speaker. Yeah.
Nobody would call any of the poetry in Shakespeare's plays autobiographical. they speak for the characters.
Right, plays we have a little bit of a different attitude towards, but the sonnets, everyone's crazy about the sonnets, yeah.
Invented all kinds of lovers, assuming.
Totally. Yeah, we've got the dark lady and the young man and the whole, yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, right? Even though the plays are also written in verse. Yeah. Andrea?
I want to point out that I think she is optimistic about religion because she's taking her children to the wall.
That too,
And if she
yeah.
didn't do that, that would say that she doesn't want to perpetrate Judaism
Right.
into the next
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
So the fact that she's bringing her kids.
Yeah, it's true.
means that she really wants to impart something to her children.
Although even in that moment, when she's saying that, it's in such a negative way. I figure I have to bring them, right? It's like, well, we have to take the kids to Disney once, right? You know, it's not, this is a meaningful experience for them. It's like, check off the list, thing you gotta do as a parent. But the fact that she's doing it, right, does say something. And so that may be very similar to the kind of cynicism we're seeing in some of the other places. Like, I'm gonna do this, but I'm not gonna open myself to feeling anything about it. Right, yeah.
Feeling that her mother sent her.
Oh, like her mother sent her?
Her mother sent her and make sure you put a note in that wall because, you know, evil eyes.
Right, right. It may be that she has some of that sort of built into her. We don't get that from the poem, like what is the thing that's compelling her? It feels like something internal, and it may be something that she has from early childhood or something else, but something is compelling her to do this. But with each step of what she does, right, fine, I have to go to the wall. Fine, I have to pick up the siddur. Fine, I have to daven. Right, but each one, she's still doing it, right? And so, like, how far does that sort of internality take you in something that you feel very cynical about? And it's taking her kind of all the way to the end here. And I think that there is a sense with the very end that it's possible that it will continue to bring her farther back, right, closer. That is, not farther away, but closer, because if she can get through that, then what's the next step after that? Because each of this is a series of coming closer, reluctantly every step of the way. Right, okay. I want to make sure we get to the last poem, so let's just turn to this one. It's the longest of the three, and it's the least Jewish, obviously. This is by Philip Larkin, who is the poet about whom I wrote my first book, and the poet who said he was very influenced by Thomas Hardy, which is what led me to my second book. So Larkin here, it's a long poem, but I think it's really worth going through and spending at least a few minutes talking about. The things I want you to pay attention to in it are the development of the character, how he seems at the beginning and how he seems at the end. It's not clear that this is he, but I am using he as a kind of default. The poet is he. It's in first person, but I don't know that, I don't believe that it's Larkin speaking for himself entirely, but I'm just gonna say he for ease here. And so how he changes from beginning to end and what his concerns are about this place that is a holy place for him. Okay, so we're going to look at this one. It's also the earliest of the three. Church going. Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats, and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new. Cleaned or restored? Someone would know. I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering, too, when churches will fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into, if we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment plate and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? Or, after dark, will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one? Power of some sort will go on in games, in riddles, seemingly at random, but superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. One of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were? Some ruin bibber randy for antique? Or Christmas addict counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh? Or will he be my representative, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this acoustered frosty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which, he once heard, was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. There's a lot going on in this poem. We could talk about this one for 3 hours also, at least. But I want to at least touch on a couple points because I think it fits into our whole question about holy places and about what brings people there and what pushes them away and what those tensions are that exist, but also in the development of the character that happens in the place. So what do you notice about him off the bat? What is he like initially when he walks into this empty church? Highly irreverent, absolutely. Even that awkward reverence there, I mean, it's a very funny line, right? What does that mean, hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence? So when you walk into a church, obviously unlike a shul, you're supposed to take off your hat. But he doesn't have a hat on to begin with, so he can't take off a hat, so he takes off his cycle clips instead. Right, so this is not a conventional approach, and you see a lot of lines and phrases that suggest that he is very irreverent and not particularly respectful of the church. Up at the holy end, some brass and stuff, right? These aren't necessarily ways that someone who's very careful about religious locations would want to speak about those places. And where do we see a change in that? Because we have a couple, I mean, even sort of mounting the lectern and speaking a loud verse, here endeth, and particularly what that verse is, here endeth, and then hearing the echoes laughing at him, even putting the Irish sixpence in, that's a coin that's worth nothing. Right, so it's like saying, I had an old bus token, so I stuck that into the, right? It's very irreverent. Where do we see a change? Do you see a change? Do you think he's like that all the way to the end?
Yes, stop, I did.
Yes, good, right. So I think at the beginning of the third stanza is the first place where we have a sense of, wait a minute, there's more going on here than just a guy making fun of churches, right? So this goes back to what I said about the first one in the synagogue, which is, I don't think you write it if you don't care. But here we have, yet stop, I did. And then this speaker becomes deeply introspective and starts saying, why am I here? What am I interested in that made me come here? In fact, I often do. This is a person who's regularly going to churches after everything that he said at the beginning, and each time he feels a loss, right? Always end much at a loss like this. And it's right after saying this place was not worth stopping for. Right? And then saying, but I keep doing it. And so the question, I think, one of the questions that's raised, at least at that point in the poem, is, what is it about holy places that draws us? What brought her to the Wailing Wall? Was it something from childhood? Was it her mother's voice echoing in her head? Was it something more special about that place? What's drawing this obviously not very religious person into a church? He's not going to pray. What's pulling him in that direction? What's bringing the person who says, I don't understand the book in my hand, where should I return to, into the synagogue? Right? What is it about human nature that asks us to keep going back to these things, even when we feel the way he does in this poem? Yeah.
For hundreds of years, there's been a tradition in England of travelers cycling, walking through the countryside, visiting churches that have been abandoned.
Absolutely.
Because of demographic changes.
Yes.
In the third stanza, he speculates and wonders
what's going to happen,
whether all churches will become disused.
That's right.
Now, that had not yet happened in 1954.
No.
But it is true now, very much in England.
There are still many churches in use, but But the country churches, yeah, absolutely. There are whole tours you can go on of country churches.
Generally speaking, in England and in much of Europe, churches on Sundays are now almost unused. And he seems to...
I don't know. Generally, you said generally in England on Sundays, churches are unused?
Compared to what it was...
Oh, okay, comparatively, sure, but there's still plenty. There's still plenty, but yes. I want to just even go one step farther than what you said. He doesn't wonder what will happen, and doesn't wonder whether the churches will go out of use. He says when, not if. When churches will fall completely out of use. It's not a question if it's going to happen for this speaker. It's when. When it happens, what's going to happen to them? And he gives a few choices, right? Is it a place that will keep them on show, like museums? People can come visit. That's one possibility. The things, the parchment plate and picks in locked cases. And some of them, you get this? Let the rest rent free to rein in sheep. Right? Let is sort of the Britishism for to rent them, right? But so basically that you'll have animals wandering through and the roofs will be destroyed, so the rain will just fall in. That is, they'll almost return to nature, crumble back down to nature. Yeah?
Well, I mean, in order to justify the part of the ambivalence that says, oh, I don't believe anything of this, is all nothing. So of course they're going to have to be gone one day.
Yes.
We all understand it.
Right.
But on the other hand, like in other words, he has to have a justification for both of his beliefs.
Maybe. That's interesting, yeah. I mean, I think you could potentially say, I don't believe any of this, but I see that other people do and will continue to. But he doesn't seem to think that. He sees it as a sort of nonstop downward spiral till it just ends. Yeah. Right.
What stands there, but superstition, like belief, must die.
Great line.
It's interesting that that's the position you think like, but belief, like superstition, must die.
Right.
Superstition first.
Right. Because what is he accusing the religion of being?
It's interesting how he puts superstition as if it was at a high level in belief.
I think that's part of what he's saying here, right? For him, belief has already died. So the next thing to go is superstition. And the things that he's talking about here, he sees as superstition. I mean, this idea, after dark, dubious women might come to make their children touch a particular stone. That does feel like a superstition in a way, right? Even if someone's doing it out of belief. Pick simples for a cancer. Again, that's like picking herbs, right, as a kind of homeopathic cure. Or on some advised night, see walking a dead one, right? So people coming there to see ghosts. So those are the things he's referring to immediately before he says superstition. But even there, he's really equating superstition and belief and saying belief is basically already gone. The reason people might still come around is they want to touch a magic stone, right? And so it's sort of mocking them and saying the next thing to go is superstition, right? Belief has already died, superstition will too. But what remains when disbelief is gone? I love that line. When disbelief has gone, right? Most of us think once there's disbelief, that's the end. And he's saying, no, there's even a further step, right? Once disbelief is gone, which is in a way the absence of belief altogether, right? Because disbelief means actively not believing. Beyond disbelief is lack of a memory that belief ever existed, right? Of belief even as a possibility. So, it's okay, good. So then he's going through these possibilities, and if we go on to the second page of it, something again starts to change. So it's not just a realization that he keeps stopping. Yeah, what do you think?
The last paragraph, I think, is I mean, obviously where we're going. But
Yes.
A serious house on a serious earth it is.
Right.
We've traveled in Europe, most recently in Italy.
Uh-huh.
My most overwhelming feeling,